Hello and welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching the fourth installment of our special broadcast called Namaste Trump. All right, joining me in the studio are two very special guests, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash and Professor Sreeram Chaulia. Ambassador Prakash has had a long and distinguished career in the Indian Foreign Service. He held many positions, including that of India's High Commissioner to Canada and Ambassador to South Korea. He was also the Consul General in Shanghai and the spokesperson of the Indian Foreign Ministry. And Professor Chaulia is Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs. His latest book, titled Trump, Emerging Powers in a Post-American World, was published in November last year. Professor Chaulia, if I were to ask you to take a step back in time and reflect over the evolution of the India-US ties, at least since the last 2 decades, starting with the Clinton visit in 2000, how do you see the India-US strategic partnership shape in the last 20-odd years?
Well, Ramesh, as we just mentioned, Bill Clinton, that was the opening gambit, 2000, right, when he was here. And since then, it's been a bipartisan consensus indeed. And I think the, overwhelming strategic, content has been there, especially until Obama, because these liberal internationalist US presidents always believed in propping up India as a counterbalance to authoritarian China.
Right.
And there have been lots of arguments that the US had exercised what is called strategic generosity or strategic altruism towards rising democratic power like India, so that it can maintain the balance of power in Asia and all that. So especially so with George W. Bush and also with Obama. With Trump, it has become more bilateral and transactional. There's no question about it. That's why we are all talking about the trade deal and whether it will happen or not, and all the irritants to final settlement on that. So my assessment is that the strategic component, especially the Indo-Pacific and the balance of power, and preventing Chinese hegemony in the region, that kind of has taken a back seat, and now it's more about what the US can sell and buy from India. And in that sense, Trump, by his very nature, is much more of a populist politician. He is not a liberal internationalist like any of his predecessors. So he has brought in these demands, and we are trying to work it out in a way that is mutually acceptable, right? So nonetheless, I would say that the legacy of the last 20 years, especially last let's say 16 years until Trump came, is significant, and the trade irritants notwithstanding, there is still growth. I mean, the growth in trade has slowed down lately because of he withdrew the GSP preferences and such things, but and probably Trump does not have a a grand strategy or a coalition for coalition building and multilateral coalition building where India would be a linchpin. But we are fine with that, because we are not in any way happy being a junior partner to the US, because we have our own strategic vision for Indo-Pacific, and where and when we can cooperate with the US, good for both of us. If the US is not so interested in it under Trump and is focusing more on trade and immigration and those kind of nitty-gritty issues, so be it. We'll want to maintain the legacy of this and not to let it slip away. So I think cumulative gains of the last 2 decades is something worth preserving. As Ambassador was mentioning, 20 years we've reached $150 billion worth of bilateral trade in goods and services. There's a lot of technology transfer going on. A lot of our private sectors are entwined with each other. It's
right,
not so much even the governments, the societies of both sides. Our middle classes have a lot of investment in the US. So many of them go there to study, and then there is this immigrant, the diaspora community. So it's a big relationship. Whether or not Trump has a long-term vision for this, for promoting India, nonetheless, I think it's a big relationship that we need to conserve and take forward.
Professor Chaulia, now there's no denying the fact that President Trump is in an election year in the US. Elections are due in November this year. So would Trump also have an eye on the Indian American community back home in the US, and would domestic politics figure in his engagements in Delhi, in India as well?
Well, very much so. For Trump, as we've been mentioning, the road show in Ahmedabad, I think that matters a lot, because he's a social media savvy politician and populist, so he wants to be glorified in front of a giant, global, audience, and that will then, boost his image back home, no question about it. And I think he's looking forward to it. And we have played that well, because we've understood. I think Prime Minister Modi knows how important domestic politics is for Trump's in his calculus, and both the Howdy Modi and the Namaste Trump in Ahmedabad, both of these signify that. And even with trade or any other aspect of the relationship, I think Trump wants to brag back home, that I'm securing victories for our working class and for the voters. And the diaspora, the Indian diaspora, yes, traditionally, because they have been concentrated more in the coasts, on the east coast and the west coast of the US, which have been liberal bastions, they have voted more for democratic candidates in the past. And even in terms of being donors, because Indian Americans are a very high income society, community in general. They have supported democratic candidates more in the past. But I think Trump's strategy is very clear, that this time he wants to wrest away, if not all of them, at least a significant portion of them in his favor. So surely this visit will help him, in his cause. And given that incumbents have an advantage in the US system to get re-elected, and the current scenario does look promising for Trump to get re-elected, I think he will be wanting to consolidate the Indian American vote. And the same applies to other communities. In fact, unlike the image of Trump as a far right populist, what has happened, you see, in the last 6 months, he's been emphasizing more and more African Americans and Latinos who are already US citizens, and how they're all benefiting, and that he's only opposed to illegal immigration. But those who are already in the US, who are minorities, he's saying my administration has done more for them than for any others, than any other previous president. So he is certainly looking at all what in India we call the vote banks, and if the foreign policy enables him domestically for his political goals and personal goals, so be it. And in the process, if the bilateral relationship goes ahead, I think that's what our goal is. The strategic relationship should not fall by the wayside. And I think our effort has always been to convince Trump administration to take the strategic element more seriously, because the populism comes in the way sometimes, because then it's all about how much am I gaining from India and how much are they giving me. But now I think our hope is that in the long run, if whether there's a Trump second administration or not, that we want this to go on, because we will need many partners, including the US, but not only the US, in order to maintain this balance of power in Asia and to have to expand our own influence in the Indo-Pacific.
Absolutely. Professor Chaulia, another region of interest and concern to India is Afghanistan. Now, there's a talk of a potential US-Taliban deal in the works, and it could be announced any time now. How crucial or how significant would be an American pullout from Afghanistan and its implications in particular for India?
Well, this is one area where we are struggling to adjust in a way, because for the constant presence of NATO forces since 2001 has been one kind of a strategic assurance that the Taliban or ISIS or some of the hardline jihadist groups will not take over the country right now. But Trump, for the domestic political reasons, and the American public is tired of what he calls the endless wars, he is looking to withdraw and pack up and leave from many places, including Afghanistan. So for us, the question always, the dreaded word is vacuum. What happens is there is a security vacuum in Afghanistan as the NATO forces draw down, and there I think we would have wanted more involvement in this so-called peace process, but they kept informing us after the fact and exposed, because they relied more on Pakistan to bring the Taliban to the table. And I think I would like that President Trump and Prime Minister Modi have a discussion on how India and the United States can still, even after the drawdown and after this agreement, continue to cooperate on checking these hardline jihadist groups. Because Trump, despite being an isolationist and wanting to step out of many long-term US interventions around the world, is also he makes a point about counter-terrorism, and especially using aerial warfare and such things, if not boots on the ground. So on that point, I think he will again probe us to contribute more to stabilizing Afghanistan, because Trump believes in vacating spaces, but then he says the regional power should take care of this. So we should treat this as an opportunity, where instead of riding on the coattails of the US to solve our strategic dilemmas, now we are going to be more strategically assertive, involve other regional players, and the US should also be involved. But now I think increasingly once the troops leave, the US strategic attention to Afghanistan will also decline, like has happened in the case with Syria or Iraq. So for us, we have much more stakes because there Afghanistan is SARC member. We cannot allow it to fall back into the Islamic Emirate hands of the Taliban, right? So I think with the US, we would want coordination, but if Trump is disinterested or apathetic to it, we need to have our own self-reliant strategy for stabilizing and shoring up our distant neighbor.
All right. All right. On that note, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash and Professor Sreeram Chaulia, thank you so much for joining me in the discussion. Appreciate it.